Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Zubair Abbasi, and I had the Global Institute of Law in Oxford. Today, we have with us as a guest speaker, Professor Dr. Haroun Rahimi, who is a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, Oxford University. Professor Rahimi holds a PhD from the University of Washington, where his thesis won the Best Dissertation Award in 2018. He has also written widely on various areas of law in Afghanistan context. His current research project explores legal history of Afghanistan. He is the best suited person to talk about contemporary issues in Afghanistan. The focus of his today's talk would be constitutional views of Taliban. What would a Taliban government look like? Over to you, Professor Rahimi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abbasi, for a kind introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen, share my presentation. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much for everyone joining us. As Dr. Abbasi said, I will try to explore today some of the theoretical underpinning of Taliban's constitutional views. I will try to mainly focus on two main issues. One is, what is the relationship between Sharia and state law in Taliban's views, constitutional views? And second issue, which is a correlate to the first issue, is what is the legislative power of the state? What can the state legislate? These are the two issues that have that many Muslim countries throughout the history have grappled with. They have become much more pronounced after colonialism and with the establishment of nation state. Afghanistan also has struggled with these issues over time. And I will try to paint a historical picture before turning on to Taliban's views and exploring what do they represent in that historical trajectory, what views do they represent. Before exploring these two issues from a historical perspective and then from a Taliban's perspective, I would like to just make a point about the methodology used here. Taliban are not a very transparent group, as many in the world may know. They are the details of their current thoughts, constitutional thoughts, are generally unknown. It is unlikely that there is no consensus even within the group. The materials I looked at to understand and theorize the views of Taliban there are multiple sources. One was the constitution that they drafted when they were in power after they took over Kabul in 1996. Mullah Muhammad Umar, their leader at the time, their emir, ordered a gathering of ulama in Kabul, which was headed by their Supreme Court justice, their chief justice, and they looked at the Convention of Ulama. They looked at Afghanistan past constitution, and then they, according to their own methodology, their stated methodology, the methodology that they stated, they kept the parts that was compliant with Sharia in their views and changed the other parts to bring them into compliance with the Sharia. They also instituted for the first time in Afghanistan's constitutional history, the Imarat as the political regime of Afghanistan. So that's one source we have access to. That's a draft constitution that was never really adopted as the constitution, but it was created by a group of ulama that were convened by the command of Mullah Omar. The other document that I draw heavily upon is a document called Manshur, or Charter in English. It was leaked to the public. It was never released. It was leaked to the public during the Taliban's negotiation with the US government, so much later when they were in insurgency and negotiating with the United States in 2020. And these two documents represent the views of Taliban when they were in power, and the latter could represent the views of Taliban now, after their almost 2 decades of insurgency. But with regard to the charter, there are a lot of caveats. First is that the Taliban spokesperson stated that they have no link to the document. So the Taliban have, their formal position is that they're not connected with the charter. And also the charter is an incomplete work. It reads like a first draft of a document that could be constitutional, but it's not complete. A lot of chapters are not filled in, and just basically says that it's going to be developed later on, and it's missing some parts that would be required in a normal constitution. But at the very least, it is all we have publicly available to us in terms of at least understanding views of some who are sympathetic to the Taliban view, the constitutional views of some who are sympathetic to the Taliban movement. The charter actually itself claims the authors to be a collection of Afghanistan's ulama and intellectuals, and it does not claim to be a Taliban production per se. But I still, judging from the content, there's a lot of alignment in my views that suggests that the charter at least represents views of some who are sympathetic to the Taliban. And that's since there is no publicly available constitutional document connected to the Taliban since their insurgency, that's the best information we have. There are other laws that the Taliban actually promulgated during their term in power because they were the de facto state of Afghanistan. They enacted legislation, and those laws were also published in the official Gazette, which is Afghanistan's legislative publication kind of magazine. And I also draw on those laws as well. Okay, so just methodologically, like knowing what I try to make claims that are based on these documents, and there are obviously caveats as to their reliability, as to whether they represent the current views of Taliban, as and all of those things. Just as a scholarly disclaimer, I just want to put it there. Okay, now let's go over a brief historical view, and I will try to be as succinct and as brief as possible, because I'm looking forward to have a conversation with Dr. Abbasi and everyone else who's watching about these topics. This is kind of a brief overview of Afghanistan constitutional history, a written constitution. Afghanistan had its first written constitution in 1921, right after it regained its full independence from the then British Empire. And since then, Afghanistan had multiple constitutions. The most recent one is the 2004 constitution, which is still in force. If for someone who doesn't know Afghanistan's constitutional history, I think the best way to look at it is that the first 50 years of Afghanistan constitutional history, from the first written constitution, which was adopted by King Amanullah Khan, the king that regained Afghanistan's full independence. So starting from that, and for another 50 years until the 1964 constitution, which many hail as the most kind of progressive constitution Afghanistan had before the 2004 constitution. And that constitution ushered in a decade that many historians have called decade of democracy in Afghanistan. So in that 5 decades, my understanding is that you can read constitutional history as a dialectical process, a process of back and forth between traditional ulamas and Afghan monarchs, Afghan rulers, and later on a group of Afghan intellectuals and technocrats. And these two kind of factions represented two kind of different views. The traditional ulama believe that the faqih, Sharia, which the way we understand is true fiqh, was the law of the nation, the law of the country, and the ruler job was simply to enforce fiqh. And they saw very limited legislative power for the state in areas where fiqh was traditionally dominant. When it came to matters of administration, taxation, and such, ulama had no issues with the state legislation as long as it did not contradict fiqh. And in particular, in the Afghan context, Hanafi fiqh, because Afghanistan has been historically a Hanafi the ulama, Afghan ulamas have been trained in the Hanafi madhab, and they are very strong supporters of Hanafi madhab. Afghanistan has Shias, a sizable minority of Shias, but historically, until very recently, they were not. Shia was madhab was not had very little role in the legal history of the country. So when we talk about fiqh in the Afghan context, historically, we just talk about Hanafi madhab. So ulama believe that Hanafi madhab, the preferred opinions of Hanafi madhab was the law, and the ruler job was to enforce that law. The ruler job was not really to enforce that law. Let me kind of clarify that, but just lend its support, its force to the enforcement of that law, elaborating what the Hanafi madhab says, what is the preferred opinion, what's the muftabaha, or all were to be left to ulamas, who were to be the country's judicial kind of organ, right? The judicial system, and the state would just lend its support to whatever ulama elaborated as the preferred opinion of a Hanafi fiqh on a particular issue. On the other hand, the rulers and later on the Afghan intellectuals had a different vision. First of all, they wanted a strong nation state which had its legal institutions, including judiciary, which was dependent on the state. So the judiciary was to be part of the state, not a semi-independent ulama class. It was supposed to be a branch of state. And at the beginning, they wanted the state to actually be involved in codification of fiqh. So it could not be, at the beginning, there was not a lot of disagreement as to the position that the fiqh should be the law, but there was an issue of whether the state could engage in codification of fiqh and kind of picking certain fiqh opinions. And that way, maybe pushing for more progressive views or actually pushing for a more state-controlled kind of legal system. Later on, there was much more calls for a state actually enacting laws, going beyond the fiqh. So those were two views, and I think that's the conversation that we were having in the first 5 decades of Afghanistan constitutional history. Over time, actually, the traditional ulama view lost, and the Afghan intellectual class, backed by the Afghan monarch, Afghan ruler, actually prevailed. And the 1964 constitution, the constitution that came at the end of that 5 decade, formalized that kind of theoretical win in a provision that cemented the supremacy of state law over fiqh as the law of the nation, on the condition that the state law would comply with the basic principles of Islam. So the repugnancy clause, which is, most of you know, is a clause in the constitution that says no law can be against the principles of Islam. That with that kind of limitation, state law was recognized as the primary source of law in the country. And that's kind of the 1964 arrangement. And that arrangement lasted for 10 years. 1 decade, Afghanistan experimented with constitutional monarchy, a parliamentary system. But that 10 years was ended by a coup by one of the ex-royalists. And after that 10 decade of experiment with constitutional design, with constitutional monarchy, Afghanistan kind of went through a period of constitutional instability. There were certain figures, mostly with left-leaning views, that wanted to modify the 1964 basic arrangement with issues of Sharia and state law, with regard to Sharia and state law and legislative power of state, with leftist ideas and kind of more radical kind of leftist democratic ideas. But they generally failed. Right before the last communist government in Afghanistan fell and the Mujahideen took over Kabul, Dr. Najib, who was the last communist president in Afghanistan, actually went back to the 1964 arrangement. So in an attempt to kind of ease the insurgency against the communist regime in Afghanistan, he went back to 1964 arrangement. So it shows how robust the 1964 basic negotiated solution to the problem of how a state law should relate to Sharia was. But that last attempt was unsuccessful. As I said, the communist regime failed, and Afghanistan entered through a period of Islamist constitutions. There were many drafts, none of them were adopted, but there were many drafts. The Mujahideen, which were a coalition of groups, they were not traditional Afghan ulamas. They had a lot more in common with Muslim brotherhoods or revolutionary figures in Iran. They had an idealistic view of politics. They wanted to use the state to reform the society, to implement an Islamic vision of society. So they were a statist, meaning they wanted to control the state. Ulama generally did not want to control the state, the traditional ulama. They saw the state as a necessary force, and they wanted the state to accommodate their areas of influence in areas of law, but they don't want to control the state. And the ulama, traditional ulama, generally were not social reformists. They were not after reforming the society. They were more often after preserving the status quo. But the Mujahideen kind of era, the era of Islamists, was not like that. They were revolutionary figures, wanted to reform the society, and they were states. They wanted to use the state to do that. The constitutions that were drafted at the time, the Rabbani government, the Mujahideen government, kind of a coalition government, drafted the constitution. This is an Islamist constitution, kind of an apex Islamic constitution. It talks about Islamic finance. It talks about Islamic economy. It has provisions on the sovereignty belonging to Allah, a provision that the Sharia is the source of law in the country. There is no state law supremacy clause in the Mujahideen's constitution. There is no statement that the state law would come first and fiqh would come second. So it's a truly Islamist constitution. But the Mujahideen failed. I mean, if you know a little bit about Afghanistan history, the Mujahideen had a lot of infighting. They could not agree on a political solution. So the draft constitution was never adopted. And they fell, and their infighting and the chaos that their failure created give space to the emergence of another group called Taliban. And Taliban have become infamous internationally, so I'm sure you've heard of them. They ruled Afghanistan roughly from 1996 to 2001. A big part of Afghanistan was under their control, and they were a de facto state. They also experimented with constitution making. Interestingly enough, when they drafted their own constitution, the source I described in the beginning, they pretty much kept the Mujahideen draft constitution. So their first kind of version of Islamist constitution that was formulated in Afghanistan by Islamist political parties who had a lot of connections actually with the Islamist movements of such as Maududis in Pakistan. That first draft gave Taliban the blueprint of what an Islamist constitution would look like. So they kept that. The provisions of the Taliban constitution in 1996 is almost verbatim the Mujahideen constitution, with the exception of one part, and that's the political regime. Mujahideen fundamentally accepted the principle of election, and they recognized the right of self-determination for people through elections. Taliban did not. They incorporated the Imarat as their political regime. So they just changed the political regime, but everything else was almost verbatim from the Mujahideen Islamist constitution. And that makes sense because Taliban was more or less an extension of the kind of rise of Islamist politics in Afghanistan. As you may know, after the 9/11, United States invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban regime, and brought a coalition that was fighting against Taliban, called the Northern Alliances, into a conference with Afghan political leaders in exile, the ones who were close to the last Afghanistan king. And in Bonn, Germany, they agreed on a blueprint for a new system. And in that meeting, they actually decided that the 1964 constitution should be the interim constitution until a new constitution is adopted inside Afghanistan in a grand assembly. And that was kind of a prelude for the 2004 constitution, which was later adopted, relying heavily on the 1964 constitution. On the question of relation between state law and Sharia, it pretty much reproduces the 1964 formula. It recognizes the only difference is that it recognizes the Shia madhab as a source of law in Afghanistan, as a secondary source of law in Afghanistan after Hanafi madhab. So notwithstanding the accommodation made to the Shia madhab, it pretty much goes back to 1964. So it's kind of sees itself as a continuation of a constitutional movement that led to the 1964 constitution and bypasses the current Afghanistan constitution, bypasses the Islamist movements in the country and the constitutional instabilities that came before them. And as a result, it's the current constitution of Afghanistan, it does not resolve the issue of Islamist politics in Afghanistan, because the big partisans of Islamist politics, Taliban, and also another extreme version of it, another less extreme version of it, Hizb Islami, were both excluded from the constitution making process. So there was really no need, in a way, to accommodate the Islamist political demands in the 2004 constitution. Also, the country was very tired of an extreme incarnation of Islamist politics. So there was a lot of appetite for going back to the days of Afghanistan's stability, which 1964 represented that. So that's kind of an historical overview of how the Taliban kind of constitutional views fed in Afghanistan's history. In terms of what do we know about the Taliban's legal influences, what informed their legal thoughts, constitutional as well as the laws they enacted when they were in power. I already talked about one source of influence, that was Islamist politics. And that influence come actually from the Mujahideen, not from any other source. There was an osmosis, kind of a natural exchange of ideas between Taliban and Mujahideen. And when the Taliban actually created their first constitution, they incorporated the Mujahideen constitution almost verbatim, with the exception of the Imarat. So there are Islamist politics, the views of groups like Muslim Brotherhood or Iranian Revolution, which believe in the use of a state as a vehicle for transforming society, was kind of fed into the Taliban's constitutional view through the Islamist movements that were represented in the different Mujahideen groups in Afghanistan. So that was one source of the constitutional views of Taliban. The other source is actually Deobandi influences. I'm sure many of you are from South Asia and you're familiar with the kind of network of schools that are often called Deobandi schools. They emerged in the colonial context as a reaction to the loss of political power by Muslims in the subcontinent. And the Deobandi schools, kind of their vision was that they wanted to preserve the Islamic culture and Islamic society and clean it from the influences of the West, as well as the popular religion. That's why they were anti-Sufism, some versions of them. So they were against popular religion and Western influences. And the idea of Deobandi schools was that they could retain the Islamic culture through education. That's why they are schools. They wanted to educate people in fiqh, and they saw fiqh as a treasure, as a source of Islamic culture. And by educating people in fiqh, they wanted to maintain, preserve Islamic culture against external influences, popular religion and British influences at the time, which later on became more colonial influence of other imperial influences of other places. And most Talibans had received some sort of training in Deobandi schools in Pakistan after the formation of Pakistan. So they were kind of trained in Deobandi texts. For example, Mullah Omar himself, when in some of his speeches that have legal kind of content, he draws on the Fatawi Jahangiri, which is a famous Mughal period work of kind of legislative jurisprudential fiqh treatises. That is a famous book of the Deobandi schools. I don't know if it's still being taught, but it's an influential book in Deobandi way of thinking. He references that book when he talks about the responsibility of the ruler. So that shows the Deobandi influences. Also, in other examples, when Mullah Omar talks about some of the issues like why the employees of Emarat, when they were the Emarat in charge, had to observe the attendance, so have to show up on official hours. Mullah, in a speech that is kind of attributed to Mullah Omar, he goes into a detailed analysis of the Aqd Ijara, the Islamic kind of lease contract under the Hidayah, which is also a famous Hanafi book, which is commonly taught in Deobandi schools. So there are Deobandi schools influences. They are not very visible in the constitution making of Taliban, because Deobandi school was never in charge of constitution making. They were, in Pakistan, they participate in the kind of British-style parliamentary elections and system. And prior to that, they were participants in the colonial state project. So there was really no constitution-making elements that they could draw either from traditional fiqh or from Deobandi school. So there's not a lot of Deobandi influences on the constitutional making level. But on the other laws and other legal acts they took, and some of the underpinning theories that Mullah Omar himself claimed when he was trying to justify why he was using a state power to, for example, enforce the rules he believed that existed in Islam with regard to beard, which led to a crusade of how long your beard should be. He drew on some of the Deobandi texts, fiqh texts. So that's kind of the second influences. The third one is just an institution of Emarat. And that institution of Emarat, Taliban called them political kind of movement, Emarat, their political system, the political regime they intend to establish, Emarat. It's not a blueprint, and my reading of the history is that it was not very well thought of. It was not even Taliban themselves did not have a view of what their political system would look like. Actually, for a very long time, the Taliban were meant to just disarm the strongmen, the militias, who they claimed were abusing people, and in fact they were abusing people. So they kind of emerged as a law and order and disarmament movement, and they would, for a long time, maintain that they would transfer power to a state, an Islamic state, by a state, but an state nonetheless. They did not see themselves as a state creating movement. But they eventually came to do that when they got near Kabul. They kind of took on the task of taking over the Kabul and creating a state. And they chose to create the state, a state that they called Emarat. The theoretical underpinning of Emarat are not obviously clear in the constitution. The way it is defined in the constitution is an extremely, the position of Amir, the person who will be the head of Emarat, has absolute power in area of judiciary, legislation, and executive. And he appoints all the officials of the Emarat in the judiciary, in the legislature even. There will be, under the constitution of Taliban, draft constitution, there will be an Islamic Shura, Islamic Council, but its members will be appointed by the Amir himself. So even the legislative body were appointed by the Amir, in a sense. So he would be like the absolute ruler of the country. And that's kind of the description of what it is. But the theory behind it, when I read some of the texts and the speeches that are attributed to Mullah Omar, it seems like they are extrapolating from this idea of ulul amr in the classical fiqh and some of the verses that exist around ulul amr, and their vision was that the kind of the theory the indications of the theory is that there are multiple emirs. For example, Mullah Omar, in some of his speeches, he talks about how there is a special emir, emir khas, and then there is an emir am, a general emir, and how the members of the Emarat and the Taliban have an obligation to obey the general emir over a special emir. And he also emphasizes a lot the obligation to obey the emir as the ulul amr. So it seems like it's an innovation in a sense that they are taking some of the rulings from traditional fiqh that talk about the obligation to obey the people who have authority over you. And they have kind of extrapolated that a theory of a political regime that pretty much relies on a very strict system of authority, a hierarchical authority, basically a blind, more or less absolute power of a central figure over all the other members in the state. There is a lot to be said about the Emirat as a political regime and what are its pros and cons, but it's certainly not accommodating to democracy or any form of election. As I said before, the Taliban draft constitution was pretty much verbatim in the Mujahideen constitution, draft constitution, with exception of the elections and the right of self-determination. Taliban rejected it entirely. And I will argue there are practical and normative reasons as why they did. Practically, Taliban were a unitary movement. Their success, even militarily, was dependent very much on their unitary command structure and their all of their commitment to accept the orders of Mullah Muhammad Munir. Whereas their opponent, Mujahideen, when they drafted their constitution, they were more or less a coalition of different figures. So Taliban did not need elections to determine the question of leadership, because they had a leadership and they defined themselves by their leadership. Right? Mujahideen, on the other hand, needed to resolve the question of leadership. So there was a need for them to accommodate, kind of find a solution for how to decide the question of leadership of the state. That was kind of the practical, I think, impetus behind the different views that existed. Normatively, the Mujahideen represented the modern Islamist politics version of such as Maududi, Muslim Brotherhood, and Iranian Revolution, which believed that it was possible, which believed in re-understanding the classical fiqh, and also understanding Islam as an economic theory, as a political theory, and as a social cultural kind of theory and a set of values that could be implemented with modern forms, right? Using modern formats of nation state, using modern formats of administration, using modern formats of election. So they did not see any inherent kind of contradiction between using the modern format of a democracy to implement Islamic vision. Mujahideen did not see that contradiction. Taliban, on the other hand, remained extremely traditionalist. They were extremely partisan of Hanafi orthodoxy. That's kind of their Deobandi training coming through. And they were committed to classical Hanafi texts. And their view was that since election does not have a precedent in classical fiqh texts, it should not be allowed. And therefore, they looked for alternative ways of selecting an emir. The draft constitution actually doesn't talk about the selection of the emir because Mullah Omar was the central figure, and it was, I believe, unimaginable to think about how and who would replace him. Although there are provisions as to what would happen if the Mullah Omar dies, there is provision that says the Chief Justice would act as the interim head of a state, but it leaves the question of how the new emir is going to be elected unanswered because of, I imagine at the time, the political kind of overwhelming influence of Mullah Omar. So that's kind of a brief on the Taliban's legal influences, like where their legal thoughts come from. Now, everything I told you was about the period of time where Taliban were in power, so 1996. Although there are reports that the draft constitution was reaffirmed in 2005 at the earlier stages of their insurgency against the post-2001 system. But what about now? What do Taliban believe now? Have they evolved or not? The only source we have to think about these questions would be the charter. As I explained, the charter was leaked to the public in 2020. It reads as a kind of a negotiation starter kind of document, not negotiation with the Afghanistan Republic or with the US, but an internal negotiation within the group as to what would a Taliban constitution look like. I'm making that claim because if you read the charter, it has many references to the verses of Quran, to the classical fiqh texts, which shows that it was meant to be a persuasive writing. It was not meant to be a kind of a final statement of a consensus. For example, when the Taliban drafted their constitution, they had no references to the constitution, but this charter has many footnotes, which shows that it was meant to be a persuasive writing. If one examines the charter, it appears that in defining their insurgency against the 2000 post-2001 order, Taliban anti-liberal and anti-democratic views have actually hardened. They've become more anti-liberal and anti-democratic. And it makes sense, because when they were in power, they were not really fighting against a democratic system. They were fighting other mujahideens who were also Islamists, and they were not very strong supporters of democracy or liberal values at all. As I said, most provisions of the Taliban draft constitution and the Mujahideen constitution was more or less the same, with the exception of the Emirat. And for example, they believe in the Sharia as the primary source of law. They believe that the Hanafi fiqh should be the law, is common to both texts. They believe that the job of a state is to enforce the fiqh was there. They believe that the state must enforce hijab was there. They believe that the people who hold government position must be good Muslims, like have taqwa, was shared between Mujahideen and the Taliban draft. So they were not really, Taliban were not defining themselves in against a democratic order, a liberal democracy. But since 2001, they have come to define themselves against a liberal democracy. And that's why the charter retains most of kind of the basic provisions of the draft constitution when it comes to matter of repugnancy clause or the fact that fiqh should be the law of the state. But it provides more kind of detailed examples of what un-Islamic means. And in giving examples of what the Taliban are not or what the Taliban are against, it uses examples from the post-2001 kind of liberal system. For example, it says, the charter has language that says no law in the Emirat should be against Islam. And then it goes on to say that the laws that are against Islam are such as laws of socialism, liberalism, issues of human rights, even kind of uses the basic principles that come from the draft constitution, but gives examples, clarifies meaning by defining the Taliban against their current enemy, which was the liberal system. It is a kind of common feature that the charter takes the principles of the draft constitution and then gives it content in opposition to the post-2001 system. For example, it says that the state has the obligation to enforce the fiqh, the Sharia, but it goes one step further. That's common to the draft and the charter, but it goes one step further and says any violation of Sharia hukum would be a crime in the Emirat. The previous text of the constitution did not say that, but the charter says that it would be a crime, except if there is a Sharia exemption. It's an uzr Sharia. So that's kind of it seems like the differences with the liberal order has kind of, the gulf has widened if one compares the draft constitution versus the charter with post-2004 liberal kind of democratic order. Another interesting development is on the nature of Emirat itself. As I said, in the draft constitution, the position of Amir was an absolute ruler. There was really no division of power. It was just the Amir, and all the power emanated from the Amir. But in the charter, the power of Amir is circumscribed. So there are limitations on the power of Amir. And it makes sense if one understanding the context of the group's history after the Mullah Muhammad Umar, the issue of leadership becomes much more contested. So the charter, for example, recognizes a position of deputy Amir and creates the same powers. It gives constitutional powers to the deputy that are similar to the power of the Amir. So kind of division of executive power between two figures at least. Also, the charter envisions that there would be a Darul Fatwa created that would resolve, would act as a final arbiter on questions other than the Sharia compliance of law. For the Sharia compliance of law, there will be an ulama council. So the way the charter sets up the legislative branch is that there is an ulama council and there's a political council, and the political councils considers the political issues, the ulama councils consider the religious issues, and they both kind of have to pass something together, and then Amir has to approve it for it to become the law or the policy or the order of the state. And if there is an issue of Sharia compliance, the ulama council would be the last arbiter. But if it's a matter other than a Sharia compliance, which is a matter of politics, whether left or matter of administration or public policy, then, and there's a disagreement between the political council and the ulama council, the charter envisioned that there would be a Darul Fatwa that would solve that disagreement, something akin to the Iran kind of council of experts that exists, Majlis al-Tashkhis al-Maslahat al-Nizam, which is kind of acting as arbiter between the legislature and the constitutional kind of guardian councils in Iran. But it also shows that the Amir would not be the final arbiter, possibly, and there will be a kind of another authority that would, an institution that would act as a final arbiter on even political questions. Because if it's a matter of Sharia compliance, it will be the Ulama Council, not the Darul Fatwa. So it seems like the Emirate is evolving within the Taliban movement, although not towards a democratic vision, but it's evolving towards a vision where the single figure of Amir has become less powerful constitutionally. Although everything I said about the evolution of the Emirate and the Taliban views has to be taken with a grain of salt, because the charter is not formally acknowledged by the Taliban as their constitutional document. So everything I said is based on that document. And I believe the document represents the views of some that are close to the Taliban at the very least, but we cannot say with 100% certainty. So as a way of conclusion, what will the future hold? Right? Will Afghanistan survive as a democracy, or will it become a theocracy of Emirate version? I don't have the answer, but it seems like there has to be, for if Afghanistan is to avoid a civil war, if Afghanistan is to make progress towards a political settlement as a way of avoiding another civil war, there should be these two views of the Emirate and liberal democracy have to be reconciled in a way. Some have proposed the Iranian model, where there is circumscribed democracy, there is a elected legislature, but there are Sharia oversight, there is an ulama oversight, and there is a figure of high authority, like in the case of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. In the case of Afghanistan, could be an emir who oversees all of this. So there will be like not a horizontal division of labor, but there could be a vertical division of labor, division of power, in the context of a kind of a hybrid democracy and theocracy version in Afghanistan. There's a lot to be there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot to negotiate. There's a lot for the parties to negotiate, and I really don't have the answer for that. But it seems like Afghanistan, even historically, has been going towards a push and pull period around these two lines. And now is the moment, it seems like, where those forces have to be reconciled if Afghanistan is to avoid a civil war. Or it could, the other fear would be a complete return to the Emirate, which would be only possible with a complete military victory of Taliban, which seems unlikely. The alternative seems to be between a civil war, a constitutional political settlement that would work towards a constitutional order that reconcile democratic tendencies and theocratic tendencies. An Iranian model could be a way to think about it theoretically. Obviously, Afghanistan context is a completely different context, but it would be a way to envision what it would look like. I think those are my broad thoughts in terms of what would happen moving forward. Now I would like to more hear about Dr. Abbasi's thoughts on these topics, and also hear what you think, or what you would like to talk to discuss about the themes of the talk I shared with you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rahimi. That was a wonderful overview of Afghanistan's history, and you have really contextualized. So, if I may ask you to stop sharing your screen with us. Um, I have just some basic questions. Maybe starting with when we say Taliban, we say that, oh, they were literally, it means students, but who actually are they? What do we actually mean? What's their organizational structure? You have mentioned Mullah Omar, and then now they have Mullah, another Mullah leading them. So what is the source of authority for the Taliban leader?
That's a very good question, and obviously I don't have the perfect answer for it. And again, as I said in the beginning, I'm more trying to theorize what is out there. There are people who have better knowledge of the facts on the ground, and they can give you a better kind of answer of in terms of what the group is actually is and how it actually operates. But if one were to look at the Taliban's documents, the one I described, specifically the speeches that are attributed to Mullah Omar, it seems like in their vision of Mullah Omar, at the very least, um, ordinary Afghans were not really a part of the movement. So I've been looking at the speeches that are attributed to Mullah Omar. There are 48 of them, and they're written in like conversational dialect, like someone's giving actually a speech and they were transcribed, so they're not legalistic. And none of them were addressed to Afghans or ordinary people. They're addressed to Taliban, they're addressed to the officials of the Emirate, and they're addressed to ulama. So it seems like in the political vision of Mullah Omar, there were Talibs who created an emirate, and there were Talib who became officials, so Talib officials, and then there were ulamas. The ordinary people were more subject of this movement, but they were not really part of it. So the way I try to think about it theoretically is that I believe the Taliban movement is not obviously the communist regime was a completely different regime, but they had this idea of having a party and then a state being part of the party, like a party actually having the power and then the state being an expression of the party will. That's kind of the way I think about the Taliban. It seems like there is a movement of certain figures who are Talibs, who are committed to lending their force, their body to the creation of an emirate, a political regime that represents their views. And then the state becomes their expression of that struggle in a sense. So if you want to think about it theoretically, I see comparison with a communist party creating a communist regime. That's the best way I can kind of theoretically make sense of it.
That's very interesting way of putting it. Maybe here is a deeper question that what is the source of legitimacy? Because if violence is the only source of legitimacy, then in jurisprudential terms, there is no difference between a robber and a ruler. So what really differentiates a robber from a
So
ruler is the source of legitimacy and authority.
the way they talk about this, the text I've read, is that they go again. This goes back to the Taliban being an extra state movement that had a state. So they talk about how when there is a need for jihad, and if there is no person to lead the jihad, Muslims have to get together and appoint someone as an emir. Because as you know, in classical fiqh, there's no jihad without an emir, and there's a need for a political leader for a jihad to happen. And it seems that the way they tell their stories is that there was a need for a jihad in Afghanistan. And then the movement and its leader was kind of born out of that need. So it's kind of an extra state movement that was created to address this need for jihad. So the legitimacy comes from the need to do actually jihad. And then the emir and the movement is a mechanism of kind of doing the jihad. So it's not violence, but violence, if you think about it, because it's closely tied with the issue of jihad, violence is always there. Like there will be no peaceful Taliban, because I mean, the way they understand the jihad in classical, their reading of the classical fiqh would not be like a demonstration. It's jihad and having a political leader that tells you to use your body to actually fight. So that's the best I can read from the materials in terms of how they justify the source of authority in the movement. And then the authority of the state will be an extension of the authority of the person to call the jihad and the party that actually conducted the jihad.
This is very interesting. I just want to share here one insight from my professor, Professor Dr. Muhammad Munir at International Islamic University, who has written extensively about Taliban and about the whole issue of jihad. So there's difference between jihad and qital. Jihad as actual violence, that is qital, and jihad as starting from your own self and then making the whole society better. So here the important question is that yes, there should be jihad, but for what? Maybe in Taliban's context, jihad for establishing peace and order, or jihad for enforcement of Sharia. So where do you see that which version of jihad Taliban seem to be adopting and then actually practicing?
So, as I said in the beginning, I'm trying to theorize what the Taliban actually said. So I may not agree with their understanding of what the jihad entails. I have my views are more in agreement with you. But it seems like their understanding of jihad was pretty much exclusively related to the violence and use of power. And that's a good question. To what end? Originally, the end was what you said, law and order and establishment of the Sharia. Actually, there is a speech attributed to Mullah Omar that said, "We are the foot soldiers, Taliban are the foot soldiers. We are fighting to make the establishment of Deen of Allah possible. And then we're going to hand it over to you, the ulamas, because you know what the Sharia is." So he saw the movement as just a group of people lending their bodies to make the kind of sovereignty of Sharia, which in his views would be sovereignty of ulamas, possible. But in terms of your second point is also very interesting, because later on, that's a kind of one of the first speeches in the movement. Later on, the political dynamic seems to have been towards the foot soldiers, so the Talibs, not the ulama. So, for example, long after the Taliban were in power, there was a lot of questions as to what is the role of ulama, and the ulama were they were in marginality. They were not put in power. For example, the Amr Ma'ruf department of the Taliban, which was the most powerful department in their Emirat. Later on, Mullah Omar required that there would be some alims kind of appointed to the Amr Ma'ruf to teach the people who are enforcing Amr Ma'ruf and teach the Talibs. So it seems like even though the pronounced version was that we are fighting to make the establishment of the Sharia possible, put the ulamas in charge, in actuality, the power actually was in the hands of those who were controlling violence, Talibs, the foot soldiers, who were kind of the actual implementers of the jihad in the meaning of Atal.
Here, one of the issues I've been trying to grapple with is that Taliban are not asking for khilafat. What they're labeling themselves is emirat. And if we contextualize it within Sunni political theory, emirat is limited to one particular area, unlike universality of caliphate. So this is very interesting, very interesting notion. And you have mentioned role of ulama. Would you like to enlighten us that what's the structure of ulama? We don't see, like you mentioned that Taliban are the graduates of Deobandi madrasas, but we don't see any prominent madrasa in Afghanistan. So where you might have the graduates or the ulama, or even it's very difficult even to name a single most important Afghan alim to whom you can say, oh, here, so this is the person who represent the traditional view. Would you like to enlighten us on that also?
So, I mean, that is very, I mean, there are many points you made that are very true. First of all, when I said they were graduates of Deobandi madrasas, and as you know about the state of like Islamic education in the whole subcontinent, it has been degraded. I mean, and most of the madrasas we are talking about, they're not really the famous centers of knowledge that madrasas used to be in the height of Islamic civilization. So when we say that they are graduates of madrasas, most often we mean that they were taught some classical Hanafi fiqh by most often root memorization in the madrasas in the tribal areas. Or inside Afghanistan, Eastern Afghanistan also had Deobandi style madrasas. So when I say they are graduates of madrasas, like many other graduates of Deobandi madrasas in the region, it doesn't mean they received a very high kind of quality Islamic education. In fact, most of them did not. That's kind of one point to make. But their understanding of Islam was those texts that they were taught to a certain extent. For example, Mullah Omar, there are reports that he received some rudimentary training in fiqh, and he had his own madrasa, which meant he was teaching the rudimentary text he was taught to others who knew even less than him. And when he talks, he doesn't use sophisticated legal language at all. He actually talks like an ordinary, like a person from rural Afghanistan would talk, very like dialectical and very ordinary language. But when he uses fiqh, he kind of invokes famous Deobandi texts. That's kind of one introductory point. The other point you made was also extremely important, especially when people talk about the Iranian model. The Iranian Velayat faqih model, the guardianship kind of model, the guardianship of jurist model, was born in a context of very sophisticated Islamic learning tradition. Like Qom, for example, in Iran is one of the centers of not only Shia fiqh, but also philosophy. Iran has the school of Isfahan, so many Islamic philosophers. And so as you correctly pointed out, in the context of Iran, we were dealing with an established class of ulama who had, first of all, Shia madhab is much more rational than the Hanafi Sunni madhab, the way it is understood in the Deobandi context. Because as I said, Deobandi was a reactionary movement, as you know, against colonialism. So they were very protective of the classical fiqh. They were not open to re-understanding fiqh because they saw it as an intrusion of Western thoughts. But in Iran, you had a lot more like active jihad and innovation in areas of fiqh. Also, there was a tradition of philosophy, high philosophy going on. So when we talk about having an Iranian model in Afghanistan, your questions becomes very relevant, is that who would be the ulamas, the enlightened like ulamas, who could actually use the traditional Hanafi fiqh and apply it to a modern context? You would need high caliber like alims, which were lacking at the time of Taliban. And you could argue that still Afghanistan has not become a center of Islamic learning that would have those kind of characters. There are many figures, obviously, but there is no strong tradition and there's no strong ulama class with sophisticated and producing sophisticated, innovative thoughts that would be useful to the project of a state building. Iran had that. I mean, Khomeini himself wrote on these themes. He was trained in Islamic philosophy, and Khomeini was not alone. He was one of many in Iranian tradition. So your question becomes very relevant when we talk about what would a kind of a compromise look like. And it becomes relevant in the context of Taliban government as well. When I said that Taliban said they wanted to give the power to ulama, they ended up not doing that. And you could pose the question the other way. There were not ulama who could take over of the state. It was really no alim that could take on like the roles that the Khomeini did in the context of Iran, and there was no ulama class, organized ulama class, who could take on the role that the ulama Rouhaniyun did in the context of Iranian revolution. So there was the kind of institutional gaps there as well. I hope I answered your question at least a little bit.
I think this is very interesting, and it just leads me then to my next question. If that is the case, if Taliban's legitimacy is not coming from their training as ulama, or it's not based on fiqh, just like Velayat faqih, then to what extent this is true to call them as theocracy, their model? To what extent we can call their model as theocracy? Because unlike Iranian model, where you have this whole philosophical foundation for the political and constitutional system based on the theory of Velayat faqih, for Taliban, it just seems, so what is Amirat? So what is the justification? What is the legitimacy? What's the source of authority for the Amirat? That is not clear.
You're absolutely right, Nick. I mean, one is what they formulate, and as I said, the formulation, if you want to kind of follow the logic of legitimacy, is that there's a need to wage jihad for the purpose of establishing Sharia. And that's why we had to organize, band together, and that's why we had to select an Amir to conduct jihad under. And if you could ask them what was the purpose of the jihad, they would say to establish Sharia. And if you could ask them to clarify what the Sharia is, they would say ulama. That's kind of the text. But in actuality, partly because of the fact that I believe there was the Talibs, which were according to even Mullah Omar, Talibs were the foot soldiers, the people who were using their bodies to make the establishment of Sharia possible. They were not supposed to be the philosophers who would be running, or the alims who would be running the state. The balance of power never shifted towards the ulama. And you could argue that it was the Talibs preserving power for themselves. Mullah Omar, who himself saw himself as the Talib in chief, not the alim in chief. He was like more the chief Talib, like the chief foot soldier, and he would call himself the Khadim al-Muslimin and Mujahid. Never he would call himself the alim. And you could say that they did not want to hand over the power to the ulama, so they did not want to fulfill the promise of creating a theocracy, putting ulamas in charge. But you could also kind of look at from the ulama's perspective. There was no really ready made political kind of ulama class who could take on philosophically, practically, and any way you can think of, even in terms of like just the sheer being able to run the state, like the Rouhaniyun in Iran did. I mean, Iranian ulamas became ministers. They became they sat on the courts, and they kind of both came up with an idea they actually went and implemented. You could debate as to how brutal it was, how undemocratic it was, but they were able to do it because there was as you said, a philosophical tradition, there was a rich Islamic learning tradition, and a class, organized class of ulama. Afghanistan lacked that. So there was, I think, the supply and demand problem, if you want to use that language. It could have been that the Talibs did not provided opportunity for a theocracy to take form, and there was really no agent to create a theocracy in a sense of an ulama philosopher or ulama ruler. There was no such a model.
I think this has been a fascinating session. Unfortunately, we are running over time. So I would thank you very much for your enlightening discussion and providing excellent answers and responses to my questions. Um, I think this issue is not going to end very soon. We'll see that a lot more would be happening in future. So maybe, Professor Rahimi, we would be requesting you to join us later for our future sessions. For now, I thank you very much for joining us. Take care, and we will be looking forward to hosting you in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.